We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Vav Amid Beis in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 56b. The Mishnah continues, Kachim Shuchai Bacharayus, and if you have Kachim, and the person is responsible for that Kachim, so then Yesh Lehen Ona. Then there is Ona. Ona does apply to that kind of Kachim. V'she'eno Chai Bacharayus, but let's say it's Kachim and the owner is not responsible, so then Ein Lehen Ona, so then there is no Ona with that kind of Kachim. The basic distinction is, if the owner is Chai Bacharayus, and so he has a stake, it's sort of like it's his, so then it's a regular transaction, there's Ona, but if he has no responsibility, he has no stake, so then it's Kachim, and there is no Ona. Rashi explains, Kachim Shechai Bacharayus, and Omar Harei Olai Ola. For example, a person says, he takes upon himself, it is upon me that I have to bring a carbon Ola. Ve'frisha, then he separates an animal to fulfill his responsibility. V'humama, and then it gets a blemish, umachar, and he sells it, so Yesh Lehen Ona, that has Ona. The Kavan Dim Meso Nignava, the reason is, if that animal dies or gets stolen, Chai Bacharayusa, he's Chai, he's responsible to bring a different animal instead, so therefore Didehi, so therefore that animal is considered, it's considered to be his. Ve'altonu Ishas Achiv Karina Bey, so therefore the pasuk which says a person can't exploit another person, this is considered to be his, and therefore that applies. However, V'she'eno Chai Bacharayus, and let's say you have an animal, but there's no Chai Bacharayus, Kagon Damar Harezu, the case would be, let's say a person designates a specific animal, he says this animal is going to be a carbon. Now if that animal is stolen or dies, he's not responsible to get another animal, it's only this animal, that's considered totally kachim, so to speak, and therefore there is no ona'ah. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Yehuda says, Afa mocher sefer Torah behemo margalis, even if somebody sells a sefer Torah or a domesticated animal or a pearl, ein lahem ona, there's no ona in those situations, no halach of exploitation. Amru lo, they said to him, lo amru elo eselu, they said that only by these items. And Rashi says, Af hamocher sefer Torah mefarish taima begemar bebaraisa. The reason for this, in terms of the halacha of selling sefer Torah behema margalis, the reason is going to be explained in the Gemara in the Braisa. And the Gemara says, Minahani Mili, from where do we know that these items listed in the Mishnah, this is right at the beginning of the Mishnah, the previous summit, how do we know that there's no Ona by these items? The Tana Rabbanan, because the rabbis taught, V'chisimkru memkar la'amisecha okana miyad amisecha. This is the pasuk by Ona, it talks about selling and buying, and we understand it says, miyad amisecha davar hanikna miyad liyad. We're talking about something that goes from one hand to the other, essentially a movable object. Yatsu karkos she'enan metaltalin, that excludes land, which is not movable, and therefore land is not part of the halachas of Ona. Yatsu avadim shukshu lekarkos, it also excludes slaves, because slaves are compared to land. And Yatsu shtaros, it also excludes documents, tichsiv, as it's written, v'chisimkaru memkar, it says you're going to sell something. That means to say, shagufo machar v'gufo kani, it means the item itself is being sold, the item itself is being bought. Yatsu shtaros, that excludes documents, because by documents, it's not the piece of paper that's being sold, it's the debt that is written up, that is contained within the piece of paper, and that's why that's excluded. Yatsu shtaros, it excludes documents. She'ein gufan machar ve'ein gufan kanoi. It's not it itself that's being sold. It's not it itself that's being bought. Ve'ein omden el l'raya shebehem, that you only keep them because of the evidence, because of the proof that they produce. Mikan amru, from here they say hamocher shtarosav. If somebody sells his documents lebosam, let's say he sells it lebosam, means to say to one who deals with perfumes, and he's essentially going to use the piece of paper in order to close up the containers. So then yesh lahem ona. Then there is ona, because there he's selling the actual paper, he's not selling it as a proof of a particular debt. And Rashi explains, Davar hanikna miyad liyad, something that is acquired from one hand to the other, hizir Allah bevaltonu. So then there's a warning about exploitation. Shehukshu lekarko, slaves are compared to land. T'chsiv, as it's written, v'snachaltem osam v'gomer hukshu la'achuza. There's a comparison made in the pasuk. Mikan number, from here they say, midelo imit shtaris, ela mishum dein gufan kanei umacher, from the fact that shtaris are excluded only because you're not selling the paper really itself, but really it's talking about the debt that is contained. So therefore, hamocher shtaros of lebosam, if somebody sells his documents to a perfumer, Lotzor behem avkas samimonim, again he's using it to close up the container where he has a samimonim, nimsum em karan, shal elo tzorach tash meshgufanu, so that sale is actually for the purpose of the paper itself, so then yesh lahen ona, then there would be ona de gufan kani umacher, because there the actual object is being bought and sold. But the Gemara continues, Pshita, isn't that obvious that if a person sells documents lebosim and you're using the actual paper, of course there's ona. As Rashi says, Pshita, ma'ishnam yikol metaltalei diyalma, why would that be different than any other metaltalin? That seems too obvious. And the Gemara answers to that, la'afukim midar Rav Kahana. It's not so obvious, it's to exclude the position of Rav Kahana. Diyamar, because Rav Kahana says, ein ona leprutos, there's no ona if you're dealing with things as small as prutos, as small as the copper prutos. Rashi explains, leprutos, stam mocher shtaros lebosim, when you sell these documents to a bosim, Ein shem hamekach shel iser biyachid. It doesn't even amount to an iser. Ela shel prutos. It's only prutos. It's a very small value. If Kahana says there's no ona at such small amounts of money, and so Kamash Malon, that's what it's coming to teach us. No, that yesh ona leprutos. There is ona even when you're dealing with small amounts, even when it's just prutos. And the Gemara continues, Hekdesh. So what about Hekdesh? How do we know there's no by Hekdesh? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, this is the pasuk again that is referring to Ona. It says, Al tonu ish es achiv. It says a man should not exploit his brother, and we understand from that achiv v'lo Hekdesh. We understand his brother and not Hekdesh. But the Gemara continues, Maskif lo Rabba bar Memel. Rabba bar Memel asked the following question. We're learning out here from the word yado that it has to be a movable object, something that you sell from one hand to the other. Anytime it says the word yado, it means to say literally a hand. But according to that, it's written, it says he took all of the land from his hand. And that was talking about in a war. Obviously, he's not holding the land in his hand. Do you think he's holding all of the land in his hand? So rather what it means, yado doesn't mean his hand, it means his possession. So hachanami mirashuso. So over here, we're just talking about selling from one possession to the other. Why are we taking the pasuk so literally? But the Gemara says back, it's not true. Do you think when it says yado, it doesn't actually mean his hand? We'll show you some examples where yad is taken literally. But we learned in a brayso, it says if the theft is found in his hand, and the brayso says, Ein li ela yado, now I only know actually his hand. Gago chatzer v'karfifo minayin, how do we know his roof or his courtyard or his enclosed area? Talmud lomer im himatze timatze. The pasuk says if it's surely found, mikol makam, we learn that from himatze timatze to include other things beyond an actual hand. And so the Gemara says, time at the cause of rachmanim himatze timatze. The only reason we're expanding beyond the hand is because of the pasuk says himatze timatze. Halavachi, but if not for this, hava mina kol hechad dechas of yado mamishu. I would think anytime it says yado, it means his actual hand. And we'll bring another proof. Visu and further, Tanya will end in a brayso. V'nasan biyad, it says that the bill of divorce is given to her hand. And the brayso says, Ein li ela yada, I only know her hand. Gaga chatzer v'karfifa minayin. How do we know her roof and her courtyard or her enclosed area? Talmud lomer v'nasan, it says v'nasan, he gives it, mikol makom, in any type of giving. And so again, time at the cost of rachman v'nasan, it's only because the pasuk says v'nasan. Halav hachi, if not for that, hava min kol echad dechas of yado, I would think, anytime it says yado mamish, again, it literally means hand. So here we have evidence that the word yad is taken literally. And so the Gemara ultimately says, rather you say like this, kol yado mamishu. Rather, anytime it says yado, we take it literally, it means the hand. V'shani hasam, and it's different over there when we're talking about conquering the land in terms of a battle, in terms of a war. There's no other way to interpret it. You can't say that he's actually holding all the land in his hand. So elamir shu, so it has to mean from his possession. So there it means possession, but in general, we do take the word yad literally. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rabbi Zeir asked the following question, Schirus yesh lo ono, o ein lo ono, when it comes to renting, is there a halach of exploitation or not? Memkar amar achmona, the pasuk says a sale, avalo schirus, and we would say that does not apply to rental. O dilmer, maybe lo shna, maybe there's no difference between a rental and a sale. Amar le Abaya said to him, Miksiv memkar liolam, does it say it has to be a forever sale? Memkar stamaksiv, it just says it's a sale. V'hainami biyomi mechirahi, and also when it comes to rental, that's a sale for a day, that's considered in the category of a sale, and therefore there is a halacha of ona. And the Gemara continues, Boy, Rava asked the following question, Chiton v'zarn bekarka ma. What if a person has wheat kernels and he plants them in the ground? What's the halacha if you're selling those? Yesh lehem ona, oein lehem ona. Is there considered to be a halacha of exploitation there or not? Meaning to say, is it considered to be land or not? Command the shadyan b'chadod damian. On the one hand, we could say it's as if he put it into a jug. V'yesh lehem ona, and it has ona. He's just selling wheat kernels. What's the difference if he puts it in a container or puts it in the ground? Oh, Dilmor, maybe, but al gav ara, maybe it becomes nullified into the ground. It's like part of the land, and just like there's no ona by land, there would be no ona by these wheat kernels. And the Gemara says, well, hechidami, well, what exactly is the case that there's exploitation? If the case is that he said that you should throw in 6 of them, and then witnesses come, and they say that there were only 5. And so essentially it was sold the wrong amount. The exploitation was that it's the wrong number of wheat kernels. But Rava said, anytime you have something in terms of measurement or weight or number, where it's like the wrong number of items, so even if it's less than the normal shear of ona, even if it's a exploitation of less than a 6th, choser, you have to go back on that sale. That's not your typical case of ona anyway. And so the Gemara says, Ella, rather, the case is as follows. He says, I want you to put in the amount of wheat kernels that's generally fit for this land. And it turns out that he didn't put in what was really fit for that land. He didn't put in that amount. So that's the question. Yesh lemono, ein lemono. Is that included within the halacha of ona or not? Is it as if he put it into a jug? V'yesh lemono, and there would be ona. Or maybe you say it's nullified and it's part of the ground, and therefore there is no ona. And a similar question as well, nishboin alein or ein nishboin alein, there's a halacha of moed b'mixas. If you partially admit to something, you make a shvu of moed b'mixas. That doesn't apply to land. So again, the same thing with these wheat kernels. If he's moed b'mixas about them, would you take a shvu on them or would you not take a shvu on them? Command shadyin b'chadadamin, is it as if they're in a jug, v'nishboin alein, and therefore there would be a shvu? O dilma batlinu agavar, or maybe you say, no, again, it's nullified to the earth, and there is no shvuah. And a similar question, omer matir, no ein omer matir, and when we say that the carbon omer, that is generally matir, what we call chadash and yashan, so once the carbon omer is brought, so all of the grain that was previously already growing before the omer, so that becomes permitted through the omer. So again, does that apply by these wheat kernels or not? Does it matter them or does it not matter them? And Rashi explains that if the dispute is that he didn't put in enough kernels, so then choser, so then for sure that sale is going to go back. That has nothing to do with ona, even if it's considered land, you go back on that sale. The mekach so that's what's called a mekach tos. It's a mistaken purchase. He said you should do it in this fashion, and it wasn't done. The kevan sham mekach so since that's considered a mekach tos, even if you're going to say that the kernels are part of the land, choser, you're still going to go back on the sale. The nehid the imit karkos midin ona, because granted land is excluded from exploitation. But it's not excluded from mekachtos. There's not a sale at all. He didn't buy it with this understanding. He thought there would be a certain amount in the ground, and then there was less than that. So certainly you're going to say in that situation it's a mekachtos. And so then the Gemara said, well, the case could be kideboila. He said you should put in what's appropriate. What's appropriate for this amount of land. Anytime you have something like an estimation where it's common that you can make a mistake, that already is in the category of ona, so that could be our question. And then the Gemara asked also, similar along the same lines, Nishboin alein, is there a shvuas moed b'mixas? Im hoed b'mixas, let's say he admitted partially, could go into anu pasakti imi lizroa vav shemasarti lach. He said to him, we made a deal that you were going to plant 6 that I gave to you. V'zarat chamish, and you only did 5. When he says, zarati chamish umechsa, I did 5.5, so he's moed b'mixas. And then finally, the last question was, omer matiran, does it permit these kernels? Now, right now we think, says Rashi, kasal kadaitach, right now we think agidulin did too. We're talking about the kernels have grown a little bit, and we're asking if the omer is matir. Kami boile. That's what we think the question is. That's why the Gemara is about to ask: are we talking about where they took root before the omer? Because that would make the difference in such a situation. As the Gemara now continues, hey chidami, what exactly is the case in terms of your question of omer matiran, oein omer matiran? Ida esrosh, if they took root before the omer, so tanina, that halacha was already taught, and ida lo esrosh tanina, if it didn't take root, that was also taught. As the Gemara says, the Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah Menachos, im hishrishu kodim laomer, as long as it took root before the omer matiron, so then the omer makes it mutter. It's now not a problem of chadash. It's considered yashan, and you're allowed to have it. V'imlav, and if not, asur, and then it's going to be aser at sheyavo omer haba, until the next omer comes. So what exactly is the question over here in terms of the kernels in the ground? And the Gemara says, lo no tzrich, it's necessary. The question is as follows: dechatz dinu v'zarinu kodim laomer. What happened was he harvested it and then he planted it before the omer. And then the omer passed. And it did not take root before the omer. And Rashi explains, what happened was he took it from the chadash, from the new grain, and we really need the omer to come in order to eat it. But then instead of eating it, then before the omer came, he went and planted these kernels. And now the omer passed when it didn't take root. Meaning to say, had he, let's say, taken these kernels, and they have certainly taken root and they've grown before the omer, and the omer came, that would be mutter. That would be a classic situation of yashan. But instead, he then took these kernels and he put them into the ground. They didn't take root, and so they were mutter at one point in time. And now he wants to take them out of the ground. Now they haven't taken root. He wants them to be mutter. He wants them to be considered again yashan. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Zayin Amud Aleph.